All right. Well, how's everybody doing? This will be the last video notes we have for the school year. Obviously, we didn't get through the entire book. I was hoping to get a little bit further, and if we probably would have had a regular class, we would have gotten further. Um, but it is what it is. So, what I'm simply going to do today is cover the Vietnam War. It says chapter 24 and 25, but this is really pretty much chapter 24 um, for what we're looking at. Um, So I do want you to, like you have been doing, put something from this day in history. It is Cinco de Mayo today, so from May 5th, something important from this day in history, and also a famous birthday from this day in history. So we're going to do a very quick overview of the Vietnam War, why it didn't go well. So really, the earliest involvement the United States has in Vietnam is with Dwight Eisenhower. Now, it's not a war yet, but North Vietnam had become communist, and they were trying to pressure South Vietnam into becoming communist. It hadn't erupted into a full-scale war involving the United States yet, but there was some warring factions between South and North Vietnam. And Eisenhower in 1954 sent 2,000 military advisors to South Vietnam. So we weren't involved in combat. We were involved in trying to train South Vietnamese troops to stop the North Vietnamese aggression. Now, when Kennedy was president, he upped that number of advisors to 16,000 advisors to help out the South Vietnamese army. But still, America was not playing a combative role. But it was under LBJ that the Vietnam conflict became an actual full fledged war involving U.S. soldiers actually fighting in the war. Part of this happened, interestingly, um, Johnson in 1964 when he runs for reelection. He runs on a resolution that he was not going to be sending American soldiers into Vietnam. Everybody assumed that if Gary Goldwater had become president, that he would have sent troops into Vietnam. Um, but it is actually LBJ who escalates this into an all-out war. Now, it is partly due to an event that occurred in 1964. In the middle of the summer, American destroyer Maddox repulsed an attack by a North Vietnamese patrol boat in the Gulf of Tonkin. Although the affair was relatively minor, Johnson denounced it as an attack on an American vessel and asked Congress to pass a joint resolution giving him authority to respond to the communist aggression in Vietnam. Congress overwhelmingly approved the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was basically the determination of the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. So they gave the president an immense amount of power to try to take on any threat that the president felt was going on in Vietnam. Obviously, we already went over Johnson gets elected in 1964. And by 1968, going into his last year in office, there were over 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. So the war became, well, the conflict, you would call it almost, became a full fledged war for the United States, involving nearly over 500,000 troops from the United States. Now, what made this war so difficult to win and so elusive to win? There's several factors, and these all, to me, actually play a huge role. Um, so this is true guerrilla warfare. We've talked about guerrilla warfare in uh, government class, I believe, when we talked about early American history and the Revolutionary War. We might even have talked about it in world history a little bit when we really talk about the American Revolution. But this is the type of war where you don't line your soldiers up. It's just surprise attacks from jungles, from forests. You don't have a good idea where the enemy is hiding. Now, this is harder to do today due to technology. You can, find heat signatures and all kinds of things to make this harder today. But this is a war that's not going to have true front lines, and it's going to be made even tougher by something called the Viet Cong, which is a lot of the guerrilla warfare part. So you had obviously America during this time period in trying to help South Vietnam is at war with North Vietnam. But there were a lot of communist sympathizers and communists inside of South Vietnam. They were known as the Viet Cong. They would look just like the South Vietnamese, be dressed just like the South Vietnamese, and they would appear like they were probably peaceful and friendly, but they could be your enemy. This meant attacks could literally come from anywhere at any time. They weren't wearing uniforms, made it very difficult to identify who the enemy was. Also, supplies for the communists were coming from every direction. Oftentimes, you try to cut the supply lines to your enemy to try to win the war. But in this case, North Vietnamese were getting supplies from the north and also from their west, where Cambodia and Laos were also sympathetic towards North Vietnam and helping them, giving them supplies. America's, we're going to find out, trying to fight a limited defensive war, not really wanting to get to war with any other country but North Vietnam. So they're not really willing to shut down Laos and Cambodia until much later in the war, possibly to help out in this area. So the communists tend to have no problem getting their supplies. It also doesn't help that South Vietnam was, although not a communist government, it was a corrupt government that was pretty anti-democratic. So they, you're fighting to help South Vietnam so they don't become communists, but what they really have as a government is also not that great either. This is different than the Korean War, where South Korea was actually a pretty democratic government. It wasn't corrupt. So you had, this sense that you were working for something good. But this corrupt government oftentimes keeps America's involvement from working as well as it should. Also, lastly, and to me, one of the biggest reasons is America was determined, especially under um, Lyndon Johnson, to fight a limited defensive war. Now, when Nixon takes over, we'll talk about him later. In some ways, he actually reduces troops, but he is willing to do more things to possibly win the war. At the same time, you want to fight a limited war. You don't want to send over, millions and millions of troops. You're more worried about defending South Vietnam than, taking out North Vietnam and going on the offensive very often. So that does make it difficult as well. A limited war we saw in Korea did create a status quo of separating North and South. That's kind of what they're hoping for here. But the North Vietnamese had infiltrated a lot into South Vietnam, so it was going to be more difficult to fight this limited type of defensive war. What I mean by that is if America had maybe dedicated 2-3 million troops, which I'm not saying they should have, but I'm saying if they had, it's possible America does win this war and wins it pretty handily. But America never dedicated themselves to this war like they did something like World War II, partly because, the enemy's not as clear as like Hitler and the Nazis, trying to take over Europe. The Vietnam War, early on, people actually tended to support the Vietnam War. That was an important factor of getting some war support. But the problem is there was misrepresentation and all-out deception by the government. Why the misrepresentation and deception? Lyndon Johnson was actually afraid if people understood how big the war had become, that people would stop supporting his Great Society plan, his plan to take on poverty in the United States. So what he did was hide the truth about how many troops were in Vietnam, how much the war had escalated. But really, one event changes those perceptions for the United States. And this is something that becomes known as the Tet Offensive. Up to this point in time, this is not until about 1968, the war had mostly positive response from American citizens that were on board with fighting against this. The Tet Offensive is part of a holiday in Vietnam. So in January of 1968, during the South Vietnamese celebration of the Tet, which is the Lunar New Year, which takes place on January 30th, the Viet Cong infiltrated many major cities in the South. They smuggled in arms, oftentimes carrying them in coffins during funeral processions. And then on the first day of the new year, 60,000 Viet Cong troops launched attacks on every major strategic point in South Vietnam. One force even captured part of a U.S. embassy for a time. In the weeks that followed the attacks, Americans and South Vietnamese forces drove back the enemy, recapturing what had been lost and inflicting massive casualties on these Viet Cong. So militarily, the Tet Offensive was a failure to the communists. The U.S. and the South Vietnamese forces were able to fight back against the Tet Offensive. However, what it was a failure is it changed the public perception of the war. Television newscasts emphasized the negative aspects of the suddenness of the attack and the heavy losses, thus leading many Americans to believe that the Tet Offensive was actually a communist victory. So the reporting early in the war was a little more unbiased. By the time you get to this time, the Tet Offensive, the overwhelming majority of reporting for the Vietnam War becomes extremely negative. We talked about last year in government class how there was even the story of, it was reported in the newspapers at least that um, a American soldier had cut the ears off a Vietnamese soldier, which he did do, but he did that because the reporter and the cameraman convinced him to do it. I don't know why the soldier did it. Don't get me wrong, the soldier was still ridiculous for doing that, but they were trying to pursue a story now that was very anti. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but that's obviously going to bleed over into American society. Well, as of May 1968, they began peace talks in Paris between some of the leaders of the United States and North Vietnam to end the Vietnam War. And you're like, wow, that's pretty short. These peace talks go on for 5 years. So the war is going to continue for 5 more years. But for this portion of the war, there will be a different president. So President Nixon gets elected in 1968, becomes president in 1969. I'm not going to go over the election results for Nixon's election in 68 or his reelection in 72. I do want you to know, because I would think, based upon what you know about Nixon and the fact, his disgrace from the scandals, you would think nobody liked him and he was unpopular. He was reelected by huge numbers in 1972. He was actually a fairly popular president at that point in time. So it's important to understand that, because I think people automatically assume Nixon was just hated his entire time. He got reelected, and he got reelected easily. So as Nixon becomes president, he does a couple things. So he somewhat reduces America's involvement, but he also expands America's involvement in different ways. He does reduce the number of troops by a great deal. So in the first 4 years he takes office, he moves the amount of American troops in Vietnam from 500,000 to 140,000. Okay, those 140,000 are very actively involved still in the war. However, his goal is more to train the South Vietnamese army once again to help them fight. What he does do that expands the war, and he does this in secret, not sharing this with the public. So once again, keeping that secretive thing going, which doesn't really help people get on board once things become evident. But what he chooses to do is, since Cambodia and Laos are pretty much communists themselves, and they are giving supplies to the north, he decides to attack strategically into those two countries. So he escalates the war outside of Vietnam, and he begins to take the war into North Vietnam a little bit as well. And not just a defensive war, but more of an offensive war. Well, there's a lot of dissent in the United States and a huge anti-war movement. The first thing that happens here is a court-martial of Lieutenant William Calley. In 1968, Calley led his platoon into a South Vietnamese village. There, they killed over 300 unarmed civilians who were suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. When word of the massacre leaked out, the army launched an investigation and a series of court-martials lasting for 2 years, from 1969 to 1971. Only Calley was convicted. Americans were appalled by such slaughter by American troops. However, a large segment of the American population, however, also sympathized with Calley. They believed that either he was being made a scapegoat by the army to cover up for other officers, or that he was being persecuted by the anti-war movement over their anger. He did get a life sentence, but it was reduced to 20 years, and they actually placed him under a mild form of house arrest. Nixon is the one who reduced that. So I'm not. Maybe he was totally guilty of war crimes, but maybe there was truth to the fact that those people were supporters of Viet Cong. I don't know that, but the way it was reported by the media was very negative. Although he did have some sympathy. You also have the rise of just protests across the nation. Many of those taking place on college campuses. In May 1970 at Kent State University near Cleveland, demonstrators protested the invasion of Cambodia once they found out about it. They rioted. They burnt an ROTC building there on the campus. The governor of Ohio called in the National Guard. On May 4th, a group of protesters taunted the guardsmen and hurled rocks at them. A few of the soldiers panicked and fired. 4 students died, 2 of whom were simply walking to class, who weren't even a part of the protest. 9 more were injured. So, I mean, the troops should not have shot, but they also shouldn't have been burning down buildings at the soldiers. So this is important because I guarantee you, if you just probably hear some versions of the story, they would say that the students did hardly anything to warrant a shooting. Now, once again, the soldiers should not have shot. Rocks being thrown is not a reason to shoot. They needed to be better prepared. They should not have acted in the way they did. But this was just a example, and probably the worst example, but still an example of the type of protests that were going on. Definitely college campuses. You then had the Pentagon Papers in 1971, in which a Pentagon staff analyst, Daniel Ellsberg, stole a number of confidential documents concerning progress of American involvement in Vietnam and released them into the New York Times. The Nixon administration tried to block publication in the interest of national security because they were embarrassing to the government, more embarrassing to the government than they were dangerous to the nation. However, they revealed the blunders and deceptions of primarily the Kennedy and Johnson administrations in the conduct of the war. Readers learned, for example, that Johnson had drafted what became the Gulf of Tonkin resolution months before the actual incidents in the Gulf of Tonkin took place. These revelations of government deceit prompted even more anti-war sentiment. So the Pentagon Papers weren't more embarrassing because the war wasn't going well. It was just more that there was deception once again on the government's part from way back in the past to almost want to promote this war. I'll let you know, I think LBJ was definitely very on board with this war, even while he was running the candidate as someone who was not wanting to get more involved in Vietnam. Well, eventually, peace, and I put a question mark because we'll talk about why here in a minute, but peace was reached between North Vietnam and the United States and was signed off on January 7, 1973. Once again, I want to note, I say this because people talk about, if you look at the common perception among the media today, and among, I think, many Americans, they would say Republicans want war, Democrats want peace. Well, Democrats were the one who escalated this war into a war, and it was Republicans who de-escalated it and brought peace. Same with the Korean War. Democrats escalated it, Republicans brought peace. So I want to fix those perceptions as we finish here. Nixon is still president in January 7th, 1973, and he is able to make a peace agreement between North Vietnam and the United States. Now, here's the deal. In this peace treaty, it said that if North Vietnam became aggressive again, that the United States will come to the aid of South Vietnam and try to help them fight against any aggression brought against them. Well, as you can see, in 1975, North Vietnam invaded into South Vietnam once again in a massive offensive. And at this point in time, this is after Nixon resigned from office. Gerald Ford was president, and Gerald Ford did not come to the aid of South Vietnam. So America pretty much lost the Vietnam War somewhat as a result. So if you look at the peace agreement in January 7th, I wouldn't say it was a total victory, but it was a victory similar to the Korean War and the end that was had there. So if the war ended in 1973 and North Vietnam never attacks again, then you could almost say this was a victory, or at least it was something that America was able to keep South Vietnam free. But America did not keep its promise in helping South Vietnam after the attack in 1975. And I'm not saying America should have sent in troops, but you made a promise. But of course, if you were a president in 1975, sending troops to Vietnam to defend South Vietnam would have been an extremely unpopular decision, especially in a time of turmoil. And this was soon after Nixon's removal from office. So I think I'm not saying it was the right choice. I'm just saying it was a choice that would be very difficult for anybody to make. So unfortunately, the Vietnamese the North Vietnamese overrun South Vietnam and make it into a communist country. Communism in Cambodia killed 1.2 million of its own people. Interesting, North Vietnam came in and kind of relieved the Cambodian government there and actually had a more mild form of communism. It wasn't as brutal. So, why does America lose the Vietnam War? I mean, there's a lot of factors. Depends on who you look to. Some point to the fact that the South Vietnamese government was unpopular and corrupt, and the war was unwinnable as a result. Some point to the fact that it was always a limited war, and America only gave half hearted effort to win this war. Um, Also, some stress that the media reported it in such a negative way that the majority of people became very unsympathetic towards the war effort and even towards soldiers. So, because this is one of the things that is important about this. Um, in no war before or since in American history have the veterans of this war been treated so poorly by the public. Um, Even the Korean War, which some people would argue is very similar to this war, it had similar aims, similar goals. It still went differently, I realize, but it was fairly similar. People who came back from the Korean War, were well respected and were given the respect they deserved. But because the media was so negative on this war, and they even covered soldiers in a negative way, soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War were not treated well by, I'm not going to say all people, but by a lot of people in America. They saw them in a very negative light. They were just doing their duty. So that definitely had a negative impact on America's chance to win this war. Um, it's unfortunate because Vietnam is communist, and the people do not have the freedom that you would hope, especially in South Vietnam. But it is unfortunately one of those difficult moments in American history. Now, like I said, I am not going to do any more notes today. I mean, gosh, we got so many other things we could cover. I mean, obviously, we have a lot of things that I would like to have covered. And probably, like I said, we probably would have gotten to if we had had actual classes. We'd have gotten a little bit further. I do want you to answer one final question. Uh, what is your favorite junk food or snack food? Okay, so you're hungry late at night, and you want a little something because you're kind of just needing a little something. What do you turn to? I mean, is it something sweet, something salty, something in between? Maybe you're like, I don't eat snacks because I'm so healthy. But whatever it is, just share that with me. That would be great. I'm going to sign off, and this. Granted, most of you probably won't be up, so it won't matter. But this probably is getting to you a little bit later than normal because when I started to try to film this morning, the webcam wasn't working on my laptop. I don't know why. Some setting it got changed, but it took me a while to figure out how to change that. So, signing out, and I hope you guys are doing well. Uh, I wish we could have ended this class differently, mostly because I mean I won't have you guys again next year. So um, I don't want to get too sentimental, but I really enjoy teaching this class. I've enjoyed you guys as students. Finish strong, guys. Finish your final project. We'll have a test next week just over like chapter 24 stuff. So it'll be really short. Should help your grades, especially if you got even a somewhat low grade on the last test. So signing out. See you guys later.